The silence was the first lie, the one the deep ocean told you so you'd forget the crushing weight of the world above, a world that wasn't just dead, but had been meticulously unwritten. Its ink bled from the page of history by something we called the Weavers. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, and I was the last librarian at the bottom of the world, the final archivist of a book that was missing most of its pages. Tethys Deep Archive wasn't a bunker. It was a tomb for ideas. A final desperate repository sunk 7 miles beneath the Pacific, shielded from the sky by an impossible pressure of water and darkness. They thought the Weavers couldn't reach us here, that their strange, unraveling static wouldn't permeate the mantle of the planet itself. But they were wrong. The static came anyway, not like a bomb, but like a whisper, a slow corruption that bled through our comms, then our systems, and, finally, our minds. Up there, on the surface, cities didn't fall, they vanished. One day, satellite feeds showed London, bustling and alive, and the next, there was just a smooth, glassy plain under a sky the wrong color, and worse, no one could quite remember what London smelled like in the rain. The Weavers didn't conquer, they edited. They were a slow, quantum erasure, a creeping certainty that what you knew to be true simply wasn't anymore, and the effort of holding on to the memory was like trying to cup water in a sieve. I was an ontologist by trade, a specialist in the science of being, of what makes something real, a useless profession before the end, a joke at academic parties. Now, I was the last line of defense for reality itself, surrounded by the ghosts of a crew who had lost that very battle. There were 80 of us once, the best minds left, tasked with curating Project Chorus, humanity's last will and testament. Chorus wasn't a fleet of ships to save our bodies, but a network of geologically shielded servers designed to preserve our soul, a decentralized digital consciousness woven from our art, our science, our music, our mistakes. It was meant to be a ghost that would outlive our species, a story that would echo in the void long after we were gone. But the Weavers had found it, and they had begun to poison the ghost, turning our collective memory into a weapon against the few who remained. Now, I was alone. The others had succumbed to what we called cognitive dissonance decay. Their minds couldn't reconcile the world they remembered with the glitching reality the Weavers were imposing. They saw doors where there were none, heard voices from people who were never born, and eventually, their own biological processes simply forgot how to function. I'd sealed the residential wing months ago. The faint, maddening hum of their last lamentations finally silenced by a half-mile of titanium and silence. My days were a ritual of maintenance and memory. I ran diagnostics on the failing water purifiers, patched the atmospheric scrubbers with scavenged parts, and ate nutrient paste that tasted like cold static. But my real work, my sacred duty, was in the core archive. I fought for every byte of data, wrestling our history back from the creeping corruption. I'd spend hours trying to restore a single photograph of the Eiffel Tower, only to find the background had been replaced with a swirling violet nebula. Or I'd decrypt a Beethoven symphony and hear a ninth, impossible note woven through the melody, a note that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. It was a losing war, a battle of attrition against entropy itself. My only companion in this purgatory was the Echo, a fractured digital remnant of Dr. Kenji Tanaka, the architect of Chorus. He wasn't an AI. Not really. Before Tethys went dark, He'd attempted a full consciousness upload and failed. What was left was a ghost in the machine, a collection of fragmented memories and broken bits of personality that flickered through the station's internal comms. He spoke in riddles, in lines of half-remembered poetry and segments of quantum physics equations. He was less of a guide and more of a symptom of the station's sickness, another glitch in a dying system. "The library is burning. Aris." His synthesized voice would whisper from a speaker panel, glitching through a recording of Vivaldi. But the words are fireproof. Most of the time, I ignored him, another phantom in a station full of them. But lately, his pronouncements had grown more specific, more urgent. He kept repeating a phrase, a location, the silent room. "Not all doors are visible." He'd hum, his voice distorting into the sound of cracking ice. "The heart of the machine is cold and quiet." There was no silent room on any schematic of Tethys. I'd studied the blueprints until the lines were burned into my memory. I knew every conduit, every junction, every pressure seal. It didn't exist. Yet Tanaka's echo persisted, leading me on a scavenger hunt through corrupted data logs and maintenance reports that flickered in and out of existence. He'd show me a schematic of the primary server core, and for a split second, an anomalous, unlisted chamber would appear deep within its structure before dissolving back into static. It was maddening. A wild goose chase orchestrated by a dead man's digital shadow. But it was also the only new thing that had happened in 8 months. The static was getting worse. I could feel it pressing in, a low thrum at the edge of my perception. Sometimes I'd look at my hand and see my fingers blur for a moment, my own physical reality momentarily losing its certainty. I knew Tethys didn't have much time left, and neither did I. The main power conduits were beginning to crystallize, a strange, fractal growth appearing on the relays, a physical manifestation of the Weaver's influence. Soon, the station's heart, the miniature geothermal tap that gave us life, would fail. I had to know what the echo was trying to tell me. The internal network was too compromised to trust. If I tried to access the core systems directly, I'd be exposing my own mind to the raw, unfiltered corruption that had killed the rest of the crew. There was only one other way, a hardline access port on the exterior of the server housing. It meant going outside. An EVA at this depth was suicide. The pressure was over 16,000 pounds per square inch, a force that didn't just crush, but annihilated. The submersible exosuit, the Jotun, was our only protection against it. A hulking beast of ceramic composites and reinforced steel. It was designed for 2 operators. I would have to pilot it alone. The decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. The last move in a game I was destined to lose. I spent 2 days preparing the Jotun, running diagnostics until my fingers were raw and my eyes burned from staring at the console. Tanaka's echo was quiet during this time, as if holding its breath. The night before, it spoke just once, its voice clearer than I had ever heard it. "Look for the scar. Eris. Every perfect thing has one. It's where the truth gets in." The walk from the airlock to the server housing was only 200 meters across the abyssal plain, but it was the longest journey of my life. The Jotun's floodlights cut a pathetic swathe through a darkness so absolute it felt solid, a physical presence. The seabed wasn't mud or sand. It was a fine, white gray dust of unimaginable antiquity. The settled remains of millennia. Strange. Bioluminescent creatures, twisted by the pressure into alien forms, scattered before my mechanical stride. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty, it was full, a living, breathing pressure against the suit's hull. The station itself looked like a fallen cathedral, its viewport's dark eyes staring into the abyss. I followed the primary data conduit, a thick, armored cable snaking across the sea floor, and then I saw it. The main server housing was a massive, seamless sphere designed to be impenetrable, but on one side, almost hidden by an outcrop of black, volcanic rock, was what looked like a weld mark, a thin, almost invisible line that didn't match the perfect symmetry of the rest of the structure. The scar. Tanaka must have built a back door, a secret entrance known only to him. My gloved fingers, clumsy in the suit's massive gauntlets, found a recessed panel. It took nearly an hour of fumbling, my oxygen levels dipping into the yellow, but I finally managed to activate the manual override. A section of the sphere hissed open, revealing not a complex array of wiring, but a small, isolated chamber, just big enough for me to enter. Inside, the universe went quiet. The thrumming of the station, the hum of my suit, the faint psychic pressure of the static, it all vanished. The chamber was shielded, not just from the ocean, but from reality itself. And in the center, floating in a soft, internal luminescence, was a single data shard. It was unlike any technology I had ever seen. A crystalline lattice that seemed to fold in on itself, refracting light that wasn't there. This was the silent room. I connected my suit's interface cable to a port on the shard's containment field. Data flooded my helmet's display. Pure, uncorrupted, beautiful data. And with it, Tanaka's voice, whole and sane, filled my mind. Eris, thank God. I didn't know if anyone would be left to find this. It was a recording, a final message left for whoever was desperate enough to look. He explained that he knew Chorus would eventually be found by the Weavers. He had anticipated the corruption. The silent room was a Faraday cage for the soul, and the shard was what he called the keystone. They operate by subtraction. Eris, his voice explained, calm and professorial. They find the foundational code of a concept and erase it. But I found something they can't erase, something that isn't a concept but an axiom. It's a piece of our story so fundamental, so intrinsically tied to the pattern of the universe, that to erase it would be to erase themselves. He told me it was a memory, the first memory, not the first human memory, but the universe's memory of the first time a conscious thought looked at the stars and felt awe. He had somehow isolated this foundational moment, this specific, irreducible qualia, and encoded it into the crystal. It was the anchor point for our entire reality. It's not a weapon, he warned. It's a tuning fork. If you can broadcast this signal across the Chorus network, it won't destroy the Weavers, but it will force our reality to reassert itself. It will stop the glitches, inoculate the data. It will remind the universe what it's supposed to look like. The recording ended. I was left in the silence, staring at the glowing shard. The task was impossible. Broadcasting a signal of that magnitude would require routing all of Tethys's remaining power to the primary transmitter, a surge that would undoubtedly cause a total systems failure, a final, station-wide blackout. I would be broadcasting our salvation from a sinking ship, with no guarantee that anyone was left anywhere to even receive the signal. But as I reached out and took the keystone, its surface cool and impossibly smooth against my glove. I felt something I hadn't felt since the sky went wrong, a flicker of purpose that wasn't just about survival. It was about defiance. The library was burning, but I was holding the first word, and I was going to make them hear it. Stepping out of the silent room was like being born into a nightmare. The absolute, shielded quiet vanished, replaced by the roar of a universe at war with itself. The Jotun suit's internal sensors screamed with 100 new warnings, ambient energy fluctuations, structural integrity alerts, and a persistent, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of my feet and up my spine. The weavers knew I had the keystone. The pressure outside the suit felt different now, heavier, not with water, but with a malevolent attention. I clutched the crystalline shard in the suit's left gauntlet, its gentle, internal light, a stark contrast to the aggressive red of the warning icons flashing across my HUD. The walk back to the airlock began, and the abyssal plane was no longer just empty and dark, it was watching. The first attack wasn't on the suit, it was on my senses. The floodlights began to flicker, not randomly, but in a sequence. A complex rhythm that I recognized with a sickening lurch in my stomach as the opening bars of a lullaby my mother used to sing. The memory, crisp and unwelcome, bloomed in my mind a small bedroom, the scent of ozone from a summer storm. Her voice a low anchor in the dark. The weavers were in my head, pulling at the threads of my past, trying to unravel me from the inside out. I forced the memory down, focusing on the mechanical rhythm of my breathing, the cold, recycled air filling my lungs. Pattern recognition is a trap, Tanaka's echo whispered, his voice glitching through the calm, layered with the phantom lullaby. They are fishing in your stream. Do not bite. I pushed forward, the 200 meters stretching into an eternity. The bioluminescent creatures I'd seen on the way out were gone, replaced by crystalline structures that grew from the seabed like jagged, diseased coral. They pulsed with a faint, violet light, the same color I'd seen corrupting the photograph of the Eiffel Tower. They were growing toward me, their razor-sharp edges scraping against the Jotun's ceramic plating with a sound like grinding teeth. This was the physical manifestation of the static, the corruption made real. One of the larger crystals lunged, not like a plant, but like an animal, and I instinctively raised the suit's right arm, the one equipped with a high-pressure hydraulic clamp. The clamp closed around the crystal's tip, and, for a moment, I felt a jolt of feedback, not physical, but mental. I saw a flash of a world I didn't recognize, a city of towering, woven spires under a binary sun, beings of pure light moving through streets of solidified sound. It was their memory, a glimpse into the nature of the weavers themselves. And the sheer alien complexity of it almost broke my concentration. The suit's hydraulics whined in protest, and with a screech of tortured metal, the clamp shattered the crystal into 1,000 shimmering fragments. The feedback cut off, leaving me gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. They weren't just erasing us, they were overwriting us with themselves. The last 50 meters to the airlock were a blur of desperation. The Jotun was failing. The right arm was a mangled wreck, and the leg servos were seizing, forcing me into a lurching, painful limp. The lullaby had stopped, replaced by the voices of my dead crewmates, their words overlapping into an accusatory babble. You left us. Eris. You locked the door. It's so cold in here. I knew it wasn't real, but the guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the ocean itself. I slammed the suit against the outer airlock door, my fist hammering the cycle panel until the light turned green. As the outer door closed, sealing me in the antechamber, the psychic noise cut off so abruptly it felt like a physical blow. The silence of the station, once a symbol of my loneliness, was now a welcome sanctuary. I stumbled out of the suit, the keystone clutched tightly in my hand, and collapsed onto the cold deck plating, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The fight for the shard had cost me the Jotun, my only means of leaving Tethys. There was no escape now, only the mission. The station was worse than when I'd left. The crystalline growths were inside now, crawling along power conduits and ventilation shafts. The lights flickered constantly, and the air had a sharp, metallic tang. Tethys was dying, and the Weaver's infection was accelerating the decay. I made my way to the central command deck, a place I hadn't visited in months. It was a ghost ship's bridge, consoles dark, chairs empty. This had been the vibrant heart of our mission. Now it was a mausoleum. I needed a plan, a precise sequence of actions to channel the geothermal core's full output into the main broadcast spire. It was a delicate, station-wide surgery I would have to perform on a terminally ill patient. I placed the keystone into a diagnostic cradle on the main console. The moment it made contact, the screens around me flickered to life, bathed in the shard's clean, white light. The data it held began to interface with the station's corrupted systems, not cleaning them, but creating small, isolated pockets of stability where I could work. Tanaka's echo solidified, his voice coming through the main speakers with uncharacteristic clarity. The tuning fork finds its instrument, but the strings are frayed. Eris. One wrong note and they will all snap. For the next several hours, we worked. The ghost of a dead man and the last living one. I would identify a critical system power regulation, coolant flow, transmitter alignment, and the echo would dive into the corrupted code, finding pathways, rerouting data around the worst of the infection. It was like navigating a collapsing minefield. He would feed me snippets of code, schematics that were only stable for a few seconds at a time. The primary coolant conduit in Sector Gamma is compromised. He'd report, his voice dissolving into a line from a Robert Frost poem. Its walls are turning to glass, a path of most resistance. That was my cue to physically reroute the flow from a secondary terminal, bypassing the crystallized section before it could rupture and flood the core with corrosive seawater. We developed a rhythm, a strange symbiosis of man and memory. I was the hands, pulling levers, welding bypasses, and running from one end of the decaying station to the other. He was the eyes, seeing the ghost in the machine, the patterns in the static. Together, we were building a weapon out of a tomb. The plan we formulated was elegant in its suicidal simplicity. There were 3 primary power relays that fed the station's geothermal core. I would have to manually decouple them from the station's life support and internal systems, and then, using a series of emergency overrides, create a direct, unfiltered channel to the broadcast spire. The surge would be catastrophic. The spire would vaporize, the core would overload, and the entire station would be flash-boiled into oblivion. But for a fraction of a second, the keystone's axiomatic signal, amplified by the raw energy of the Earth's mantle, would scream out across the planet, a pulse of pure reality that would In theory, reset the universal source code. The problem was the third relay. The first two were accessible from a maintenance hub near the command deck, but the third, the primary regulator, was located in the geothermal core chamber itself, a place I hadn't been since the initial lockdown. It was the deepest, most shielded part of the station, the very heart of Tethys. And according to the last stable schematics Tanaka's Echo could pull up, the corruption there was almost total. The access corridor was gone, consumed by the crystalline growth. The chamber itself was reporting impossible environmental readings temperatures that fluctuated between absolute zero and the surface of the sun, atmospheric pressures that should have crushed the bulkheads. "The Weaver is nesting," Tanaka's Echo whispered, the fear in his fragmented code almost palpable. "It has made a home in our heart. It is defending its territory." To get to the final relay, I couldn't use the corridors. I would have to go through the maw, the primary geothermal intake shaft, a vertical tunnel that dropped 3 miles straight down to the planet's mantle. It was a place of unimaginable heat and pressure, serviced by a single, rickety maintenance elevator that hadn't been used in years. It was a descent into hell, and the elevator was my only ride. I stood before the reinforced blast door that led to the maw's service gantry, my hand resting on the release lever. The keystone was secure in a shielded pouch on my belt, its steady, reassuring warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread pooling in my gut. I had the key. I had the plan. But the path to save the world was a 3-mile fall into its molten core, into the heart of the enemy's new nest. The door hissed open, revealing a chasm of roaring heat and darkness. The path to the heart of Tethys was no longer just a corridor, it was a throat. And it was constricting. The elevator was a cage. And the maw was a throat lined with teeth of shadow and fire. The moment the gantry door sealed behind me, the world was reduced to the groan of ancient steel and the blood-red glow of the emergency lights inside the cramped cabin. The descent began with a lurch that felt less like mechanical movement and more like a fall. Through the reinforced plasteel viewport, I watched the gantry platform disappear into the oppressive darkness above, a final, receding memory of safety. The heat was immediate, a dry baking pressure that my utility suit struggled to dissipate. Condensation slicked the inside of my helmet, and the air from the rebreather tasted stale, cooked. 3 miles is a long way to fall. Tanaka's Echo crackled through my comm, his voice thin and stretched, as if the sheer depth was pulling his code apart. "Remember the story of Orpheus. Eris. Don't look back." But it was impossible not to. The weavers used the verticality of the shaft to play with my perception. Looking down, the shaft seemed bottomless, a column of darkness plunging into infinity. Looking up, the memory of the gantry was already being corrupted, its solid steel geometry softening, twisting into the skeletal arch of a cathedral I'd once visited in Cologne, a place I hadn't thought about in 20 years. They were digging deeper now, past the easy surface-level memories of my mother, into the foundational architecture of my identity. The first mile was a battle against vertigo and memory. The elevator shuddered on its guide cable, scraping against the shaft walls with a shriek that set my teeth on edge. The crystalline growths were thicker here, no longer just crawling along pipes, but forming massive, web-like structures that crisscrossed the chasm. They pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, like a distributed nervous system. And I had the unnerving certainty that they were tracking my descent, passing my position down the chain like a morsel being lowered into a spider's web. It was here they showed me Kenji. Not the echo, but a perfect, solid-looking memory of the man himself, standing outside the elevator, floating in the impossible heat, his face calm and reassuring. "You don't have to do this, Aris," he said. His voice, the one I remembered from 100 late-night debates over coffee, not the synthesized ghost in my comm. "There is another way. We can integrate. They don't want to destroy. They want to understand, to perfect. We can be part of something eternal." The illusion was flawless. He gestured to the crystalline webs, and for a moment, I saw their terrible beauty, the intricate, mathematical perfection of their growth, a universe without entropy, without decay, without the pain of loss. It was the ultimate academic temptation. "The song of the lotus is sweet," the real echo whispered in my ear, his voice a frantic, glitching counterpoint, "but its roots are in the mud of deceit." I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the cold weight of the keystone against my hip. "You're not real," I whispered, the words fogging my visor. The image of Kenji smiled sadly and dissolved into a shower of violet sparks. His final, illusory word echoing in the shaft, "Yet." The second mile was worse. The physical attacks began. The crystalline structures were no longer passive. They were actively hostile. Long, needle-like shards would detach from the walls and spear towards the elevator, striking the plasteel viewport with concussive force. Cracks spiderwebbed across the view, each impact sending a jarring shock through the cabin. I was a fly in a jar being shaken by a cruel god. My only defense was a small, industrial laser cutter mounted on the elevator's exterior, controlled by a clumsy joystick inside. It was meant for clearing minor obstructions, not fighting a geological infection. I spent the next hour in a state of frantic, twitching paranoia, firing bursts of the laser to intercept the incoming shards, the cabin filling with the acrid smell of ozone and superheated rock. All the while, the voices of my dead crewmates returned, no longer just whispers, but clear, distinct, and accusatory. They weren't just blaming me. They were narrating my failures, replaying every mistake, every moment of hesitation that had led to their deaths. I heard Lena, our chief engineer, describing how the air recyclers failed while I was asleep. I heard Marcus, our xenobotanist, weeping as he described the flowers in his hydroponics bay turning to dust in his hands. It was a chorus of my own guilt, weaponized and aimed directly at my sanity. They are using your own mind as a lens to focus their energy, the echo explained, his own signal struggling against the interference. Your memory is their ammunition. You must make it a poor weapon. The thought was a lifeline. I stopped fighting the memories. I let them in. I accepted them. The guilt, the grief, the crushing weight of my failures. I embraced them not as weaknesses, but as proof of my humanity. The pain was real. The loss was real. Their deaths were a part of my story, a part of the reality I was fighting to preserve. In all its flawed, heartbreaking imperfection, the voices didn't stop, but they lost their power, their sharp edges dulled by my acceptance. They became a lament, a sad, true song of what had been lost, instead of a weapon to be used against me. And then, the elevator stopped. It hung in the darkness, 1,000 feet from the bottom, its motor whining and then falling silent. The main cable was fouled, snagged by a massive crystalline growth that had erupted from the wall and fused itself around the steel strands. I was trapped. Below me, I could see the light from the geothermal core chamber, a hellish, shifting glow of orange and violet. I was so close. Desperation clawed at my throat. I looked at the emergency hatch on the floor of the cabin. Outside was a sheer drop into a furnace, but along the wall of the shaft ran a series of emergency maintenance rungs, most of them sheared off or encased in crystal. It was a broken ladder to hell. The last step is a leap of faith. Eris, the echo whispered, his voice sounding tired, finite. I cannot follow you further. The signal will not hold. The library is in your hands now. His voice faded into a final burst of static, and then he was gone. I was truly, completely alone. I strapped the keystone securely to my chest, took a deep breath, and blew the emergency hatch. Heat and pressure exploded into the cabin, a physical blow that staggered me. Clinging to the edge, I lowered myself out, the metal of the rungs scorching hot even through my suit's gloves. My descent was a nightmare of controlled falling, my muscles screaming in protest, the suit's joints grinding with the strain. I moved from one precarious handhold to the next, shards of crystal raining down around me, the roar of the geothermal vent below growing into a deafening, all-consuming presence. When my boots finally touched the gantry of the core chamber, I didn't feel relief, only a profound sense of trespass. I had arrived in the heart of their temple. The chamber was unrecognizable. The clean lines of human engineering were gone, swallowed by a living architecture of pulsating crystal and repurposed technology. The geothermal core, our tamed star, was now encased in a crystalline lattice that throbbed with a sickening, organic rhythm, like a monstrous heart. The light it cast was not the clean white of controlled fusion, but a diseased purple, and in that light, I saw the Guardian. It stood before the third and final relay, a towering effigy of fused metal and memory. It had the basic shape of a human, but it was 10 feet tall, its body a collage of stolen parts from the station deck, plating for skin, conduits for veins, and a head formed from a shattered command console, its broken screens flickering with the faces of the dead. All 80 of them. Their eyes followed my every move, their mouths opening and closing in a silent, collective scream. This was their nest, and this was their queen. It didn't speak with a voice. It spoke directly into my mind, a wave of pure, concentrated despair and longing. You are the last, the lonely one, but you don't have to be. Join us. We can be whole again. I saw it then, the perfect illusion. The chamber transformed into the Tethys command deck, bustling and alive. Lena was at her console, laughing. Marcus was showing me a newly bloomed, impossible blue orchid. Kenji was clapping me on the shoulder, telling me the mission was a success. We were all here. We were all safe. We were all together. My hand, which had been reaching for the plasma cutter on my belt, faltered. The longing to accept the illusion, to lay down my burden and rest in that beautiful lie, was the most powerful force I had ever felt. It was more powerful than the heat, more powerful than the pressure, more powerful than my own survival instinct. It was the promise of an end to pain. But through the beautiful lie, I could still feel the faint, steady warmth of the keystone on my chest. It was an anchor, a single, true note in a symphony of deception. I remembered the pain of their real deaths. I remembered the cold silence of the residential wing. That truth, as ugly as it was mine. You can't have them. I snarled, the words tearing from my throat. I raised the plasma cutter, the arc flaring to life with a vicious hiss. The illusion flickered, the faces on the Guardian's head twisting from welcoming smiles into masks of rage. The creature raised an arm made from a twisted Jotun clamp and charged. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of light and noise as I met its attack. The truth of a flawed reality crashing against the lie of a perfect one, deep in the burning heart of the world. The fight began not with a clash of metal, but with a collision of realities. The Guardian's Jotun clamp arm swung down, not with the speed of a machine, but with the impossible, instantaneous logic of a dream. I parried with the plasma cutter, the arc of superheated energy meeting the twisted metal with a scream. The impact sent a shockwave through my suit and, more alarmingly, through my mind. As our weapons met, the Guardian didn't just push, it infected. My plasma cutter sputtered, its clean, white-hot beam flickering into a sickly violet. On my HUD, the tool's diagnostic schematic appeared, its components rearranging themselves into an impossible, alien geometry. The Weaver was trying to teach my weapon a new way to be, to turn my own tool against me. I broke contact, stumbling back, the cutter's beam stabilizing, but my confidence shaken. The Guardian didn't press the physical attack. It was smarter than that. It began to deconstruct the room around me, not with force, but with ontological precision. The gantry I stood on began to lose its texture, the gritty, non-slip surface smoothing into polished marble, slick and treacherous. A support pillar twisted into a weeping willow, its metallic leaves shedding sparks onto the floor. It was weaponized surrealism, designed to make me doubt the very ground beneath my feet. If I couldn't trust my senses, I couldn't fight. It was using my own field of study against me. It was unmaking my reality. I focused on the one thing it couldn't change, the anchor point, the geothermal core behind it. Its throbbing, diseased light was a constant. I made that my true north. The Guardian lunged again, and this time I didn't meet it head-on. I dodged, rolling under its sweeping arm, the heat from the core scorching my back. I came up firing the plasma cutter, not at its body, but at the floor at its feet. The beam sliced through the corrupted deck plating, and a chunk of the gantry fell away into the roaring vent below. The creature staggered, its balance compromised. It was bound by a semblance of physics, a vulnerability, but as it regained its footing, the broken screens on its head flickered, and all 80 faces turned to stare at me. A new voice filled my mind, not the collective whisper, but a single, sharp, and terrifyingly familiar one my own. You are an archivist, Aris, a preserver. Yet here you are, destroying the last remnants of your home. You have become the entropy you sought to fight. It was my own logic, my own professional ethics, twisted into a perfect prison. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all it needed. A conduit snaked out from its body like a whip, wrapping around my leg and pulling me off my feet. I slammed onto the deck, the impact jarring my teeth. The plasma cutter flew from my grasp, skittering across the smooth marble and stopping just short of the edge. The Guardian loomed over me, a silhouette against the violent purple of the core. The faces on its console head were a swirling vortex of my friends, my colleagues, my failures. It was going to finish me. Pinned and disarmed, I did the only thing I could. I stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a librarian. The keystone wasn't a weapon to be wielded. It was an argument to be made. It was the universe's foundational, irrefutable thesis statement. I clawed at the pouch on my chest, my fingers fumbling with the seal. The creature raised its clamp arm for the final, crushing blow. My hand closed around the cool, smooth surface of the keystone. I pulled it free. The light it emitted was not bright, but it was absolute. It was a clean, pure white that did not illuminate the room so much as it interrogated it. The sickly violet light of the core recoiled from it, hissing like water on a hot plate. I held the shard aloft, not as a weapon, but as a statement of fact. The effect on the Guardian was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was a being built of lies, of stolen memories and corrupted code, a patchwork quilt of stolen identities stitched together with the thread of an alien logic. The keystone's pure, axiomatic truth was an ontological solvent to its very being. It didn't scream in pain. It screamed in confusion. The faces on its console began to separate, the stolen memories peeling away from the central consciousness. I saw Lena's face flicker, her expression of rage softening into the sad, tired look she'd had in her final days. I saw Kenji's face, not the perfect illusion from the shaft, but a memory of him, haggard and desperate, just before he attempted his final upload. They weren't weapons anymore. They were just ghosts, finally freed from their puppet master. The Guardian's body began to come apart. The conduits that formed its limbs writhed and fell away. The deck plating that was its skin clattered to the floor. The stolen pieces were returning to their mundane, true selves. The Jotun clamp fell with a deafening clang, no longer a weapon, but just a broken piece of machinery. Within seconds, all that was left was a pile of scrap metal and a low, fading hum. The 80 faces on the shattered console flickered one last time and then went dark. The silence that followed was the most profound I had ever known. The psychic pressure was gone. The core chamber was still a ruin, but it was just a ruin now, not a temple. I was alone with the ghosts of my choices, not the ghosts of my friends. My body screamed with pain. My leg was broken. The conduit had crushed the bone. My suit was failing. Red lights blinking a steady, fatalistic rhythm. But I was alive, and the path to the third relay was clear. I crawled, dragging my shattered leg behind me, every movement an agony. The relay console was fused with a crystalline growth, but the growth was inert now, just a dead, glassy shell. I used the butt of my helmet to shatter it, the impacts sending blinding flashes of pain through my skull. Beneath it, the manual release lever was still intact. It was a meter-long bar of solid steel, designed to require the full body weight of 2 technicians to move. I gripped it with both hands, my torn gloves offering little purchase. I put my boot against the console for leverage and pulled. My muscles tore. My vision went black at the edges. But the sound of the lever moving, of the heavy, magnetic clamps disengaging with a series of concussive thuds, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The third relay was decoupled. The circuit was complete. A new icon lit up on my HUD, a direct feed from the command deck. The system was armed. All it needed was my final authorization to begin the broadcast sequence. The problem was the command deck was 3 miles above me, and the elevator was a memory. The maintenance rungs were an impossible climb, even for a healthy man. There was no way back. For a moment, a cold, absolute despair washed over me. I had won the battle only to be checkmated by logistics. I had fought my way to the heart of the world only to die there. My final task just out of reach. Then I looked at the core, at the raw, untamed power of the earth itself, and an idea took shape. An idea born of pure, scientific desperation. I didn't need to be in the command deck. I had the power source right here. I had the keystone, the signal. All I needed was an antenna. I crawled back to the pile of scrap that was once the Guardian. Its largest component was a long, twisted segment of the station's primary communication spine, a dense bundle of fiber optics and conductive alloys. It was a broken piece of a system designed to listen, but with enough power, anything could be made to scream. I began to work, my mind a frantic race against the clock of my own failing body. I dragged the comm spine to the edge of the geothermal vent, positioning it so it pointed up the maw. Then, using my suit's emergency power cable, I connected one end to the severed feed of the final relay, creating a direct tap into the planet's molten heart. The final piece was the keystone. I found its interface port and jammed the other end of the power cable into it. The shard flared, its gentle white light exploding into a blinding, ferocious brilliance. The data transfer began, my HUD scrolling with terabytes of axiomatic code being force-fed into the makeshift antenna. A countdown timer appeared, blinking in calm. Clinical text. Broadcast initiation in T-120 seconds. This was it. I wouldn't be on the bridge to see the dawn. I was the fuse, buried deep in the heart of the machine. My hand rested on the activation panel, a simple, flat button that was now the trigger for the salvation or damnation of our reality. The station groaned around me, a final, dying lament. The heat was becoming unbearable, my suit's life support systems finally giving out. My last moments would be spent here, at the bottom of the world, alone. But as I looked at the countdown, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I was a librarian, and I had found the one book that could save the world. Now, all I had to do was read it aloud. My finger hovered over the button, the fate of every memory that had ever been held within that single, final point of contact. My finger touched the button. The surface was cool, a small island of calm in a world of roaring fire and imminent collapse. There was no grand, final thought, no summation of my life's purpose. There was only the quiet, professional satisfaction of a librarian about to place the final, correct book on the shelf. I pressed down. The click was inaudible against the chaos, but I felt it in my bones. A definitive, final punctuation mark at the end of a long and terrible sentence. For a single, eternal moment, nothing happened. Then, the universe held its breath and plunged into the sun. The power of the Earth's heart, raw and unfiltered, surged through the cable and struck the keystone. The world didn't go white. It became everything. It wasn't a broadcast. It was an ascension. My consciousness, already frayed and bleeding at the edges, was ripped from my failing body and woven into the signal itself. I was no longer Eris Thorne, a man in a dying suit. I was the memory of a conscious thought looking at the stars in awe. I was the Word, and the Word was being spoken. I erupted from the maw not as a wave of energy, but as a tsunami of pure, unassailable reality. I was the pressure of the deep ocean, the heat of the core, the cold of the void, all at once. I swept through the water and touched the wreckage of Tethys, and for a microsecond, I saw it as it was meant to be whole, vibrant, and full of life. I saw my crew, not as accusers, but as they were, brilliant and brave, and I felt a wave of love for them so profound it was indistinguishable from grief. Then I breached the surface. The sky above was a torn canvas of bruised violet and sick, oily yellow. I was the signal, and I rose to meet it. I spread across the globe, a shock wave of certainty moving at the speed of light. I touched the glassy plains where cities once stood, and I remembered them. I remembered the scent of hot pavement in London after a summer rain, the taste of noodles from a street cart in Tokyo, the sound of a saxophone wailing in a New Orleans alley. I wasn't just restoring data, I was forcing the universe to acknowledge its own story. As I moved, I felt them, the weavers. They weren't a presence, but an absence, a cold, perfect void where things were supposed to be. They were the static between the notes, the silence in a scream. They met my signal not with force, but with an offer of perfect, seductive emptiness. They showed me a universe without pain because it was a universe without memory, a reality without heartbreak because it was a reality without love, a story with no ending because it had no beginning. It was the peace of the void, the final, perfect silence. For a moment, I felt the pull. The librarian in me saw the logic in a perfectly ordered, unchanging system, but the man in me, the flawed, grieving, hopeful man, recoiled. I answered their silence not with an argument, but with the full, chaotic, and contradictory chorus of humanity. I showed them the joy of a first kiss and the bitterness of a final goodbye. I showed them the selfless courage of a soldier and the petty cruelty of a king. I showed them a child's unfiltered laughter and an old man's quiet regrets. I poured the entire messy, beautiful, and terrible library of our existence into their perfect void. I gave them the pain, the grief, the love, and the rage they could never comprehend because they had never truly lived. The static wavered. The void could not contain the paradox of our being. The perfect, simple logic of their unmaking was overwhelmed by the complex, irrational truth of our existence. They did not break. They simply receded, like a shadow in the face of a rising sun. Their fundamental axiom proven insufficient. They couldn't erase a story they couldn't understand. My journey was ending. The signal was fading. Its purpose served. My consciousness, stretched thin across the face of the planet, began to fray. I felt my physical self, my body in the core chamber, being consumed by the overload. The heat wasn't pain. It was just a final, intense form of information. The station, my tomb, my weapon, was vaporizing. I was a book being returned to the fire. My story told. My last coherent thought was not of victory, but of peace. The library was no longer burning. It was safe. My job was done. On the surface, in what was once the Highlands of Scotland, a woman who had lived for 8 months in a root cellar, her only companion, the fading memory of her husband's face, stepped outside. For months, the sky had been a canvas of wrongness, a constant source of low-grade dread. But today, it was blue, a deep, impossible, and heart-achingly familiar blue. She looked at her hand, at the dirt creased into her knuckles, and for the first time in nearly a year, it looked completely, unquestionably real. A bird, a real one, not a memory, landed on a nearby fence post and sang a simple, uncorrupted song. She didn't know why, but a memory surfaced, clear and bright, the feeling of her husband's hand in hers as they walked along the shore of a loch. The memory had been fuzzy for months, a photograph fading in the sun, but now it was sharp, real, and it brought tears to her eyes. The world was still ruin, a graveyard of a billion stories, but it was their ruin. It was real. She looked up at the blue sky, feeling the clean, cold air fill her lungs. She didn't know who to thank, or what had happened, but she could feel it. A subtle shift in the very fabric of the world. A new silence that wasn't empty, but full of potential. It was the quiet of a library after the last book has been shelved. A silent testament to the story that had been saved, and the librarian who had paid the price to save it. And across the wounded but whole earth, humanity began the slow, difficult work of turning to the next page.